If you listened to the news over the last week, and especially if you listened this morning, you heard the riveting story, the execution of Father Jacques Hamel in a Normandy church by Islamist warriors who slit his throat before his own altar. You might have heard this morning that many Muslims have gone to Catholic Church today in solidarity with the Christians who are in Normandy, and objection and protest against the slaying of Father Hamel. But one thing you won't hear, and you don't hear any longer, though once you did, echoed around Canada, is that your religious ideas don't matter anymore. Your God, my God, what difference does it make? All of a sudden, the God you serve equals the actions you take. And they are a huge difference. And I would cite not only France and recent developments in Europe, but recent developments in the United States as well. No longer do I hear the inconsequence of religion. So, who's my God equals who I am. Who's my God equals what I do and how I act. That's out there, and it's likely to stay. So we come to the text for the morning, which comes from the book of Hosea, in which God appears to be pouring forth his very inner life. Some of us have never met a God who has an inner life, but here is one in which God seems to be having a struggle with his own nature and remembering things. Memory is absolutely essential to being a person, and memory, therefore, is essential to having a relationship. So we're talking about a God who enters into relationship and can't forget some things. When Israel was only a child, I loved him. Hosea is fond of casting a national history in terms of family life. First, in the case of a husband who loves a wife who won't love him back. Now, as a parent loving a child and remembering that, even though that relationship's broken and the child is given over to self-destructive behavior. When Israel was only a child, I loved him. I called out my son, called him out of Egypt, created a nation out of nothing, called that nation mine. But when others called him, I was not the only religious voice out there. He ran off and left me. He worshipped the popular sex gods, which is a slightly unfortunate way to put a reference to Canaanite religion in the land in which Israel found itself. The better reference is fertility gods, in which worship of God involves sexual activity, which sort of primes the pump for the gods, who therefore engage in sexual activity, which rocks the earth and gets the crops to grow, the calves to be born, and moms to have babies, and life goes on. And the problem isn't so much sexuality as it is the idea that you've got to give God a bump because God really doesn't care and isn't really interested in you and engaged. And you sort of engage in I'll scratch your back and then you scratch my back kind of religion, a kind of stock exchange type of faith. If you go back to the shrines of Israel in those days, you find the reference there to playing at religion with toy gods, because everybody came to worship at the shrine with a clay version of Ken and Barbie. And you stuck their feet in the ground and you got the message. Ken and Barbie are getting it on here. Let's see if we can get God to get going as well. This among a people for whom God said, I want you to be holy as I am holy because I'd like people to know what I'm really like. He ran off and left me. Pardon me, the name for God was bang on. The Lord Most High. The name was right. but the character sucked. Ever seen that happen? I'm talking God and saying good news, but it's coming over in a bad news tone of voice. Where is the real, would the real God please stand up here? The real covenant-keeping God who enters into a relationship with his people and asks for faith, not sex. Still, I stuck with him. I led Ephraim, and the reference here, led Ephraim, is to a parent that gets down. Have you done it? I'm sure you have, even with a nephew or a niece, with two fingers, so that two chubby little hands can grasp a hold, and you walk awkwardly waddling back and forth like a duck behind them so that they can take those little steps. God says, I taught Ephraim, another name for Israel, I taught Ephraim how to walk, how to take their first steps. I taught them. I taught them. But he never acknowledged my help. Never admitted that I was the one pulling his wagon, that I lifted him like a baby to my cheek, that I bent down open wide and fed him. Never acknowledged that. I think there are people here who know the full range of the ways it is possible to feel about a child. There are people here who have experienced the full range of emotions that go along with a child, that leaves, won't listen, and goes into self-destructive behaviors, and nothing you say changes anything. I think there are people here who know what it's like to keep a bedroom ready, even though night after night the bed is cold, nobody's there. What we often don't realize is that the God we serve, the God whom Jesus called Father, knows exactly that feeling, has that kind of memory, engages in those kinds of emotions. Most of us still have a God who's the great rock in the sky, impassive. And theology that says, well, God really doesn't feel anything, but he has to talk that way to you because you have feelings. Excuse me? No. Here is a God at war with himself. Let me give you another story to illustrate this. It goes in the reverse of a child that remembers a parent. When I was a seminary prof, a young man, student, came to my office. I knew this student. I knew his family history. His mom had married a man with addictions who could not break free. She had 5 sons. He began to abuse every one of them. She divorced him. He left the house. And 4 of the kids said, that's it. We never talk about him again, and controlled all the language about this man so that he was never spoken of in positive terms ever again. Now, I have to hand it to this lady and to those 5 young men because they grew up, every last one of them, to be successful people. That wasn't the issue. And this man present in my office was a successful man. There was no problem with that. But he had never been allowed by his family to remember his father with love. Never once. Oh, he knew about the addictions, he knew about the abuse, but he also knew about the love. And it is so possible, you understand how we do this, don't you? You say, I remember everything like yesterday. You remember what you want to about yesterday, and you deliberately forget the rest, and so do I. And many times we control the story so nobody else remembers anything except what we want to remember, and we want them to remember, and we'll dominate the conversation till we get it our way. Ever seen that happen? Yeah. The addiction was true, the abuse was true, and so was the love. I simply looked at him after he told me his story and said to him, David, the man who could have been your father left your life a long time ago. He was at that time dead. And he folded over face down on his own knees. I can see him doing it now. And wept and sobbed and wept, doing the only loving thing that was left to do for his dad, and that was grieve. And all of those years of love that could not be expressed came out, or at least began to flow. You see, if you're in a relationship, you have to do violence to yourself and others to put an end to it. And so does God. And that's why this chapter, in the middle of a prophecy that talks about the disobedience of Israel and the judgment that's coming, stops right in the middle with this chapter that says, if you think God gets away from that without his own pain, you don't understand God at all. Now he wants to go back to Egypt and go over to Assyria, anything but return to me. That's why his cities are unsafe. The murder rate skyrockets and every plan to improve things falls to pieces. I keep wondering if this came out of the Herald this week. My people are hell-bent on leaving me. Even if they're hell-bent on naming me the wrong way constantly, saying God, it still doesn't mean the relationship that I want with them. They pray to the god Baal for help, and he doesn't lift a finger to help them. In the age in which this was written, already the nation to which Hosea was speaking, and Hosea could see this coming on the horizon, had been decimated by a foreign nation. And everybody was hunting around for partners, for friends. Sounds like Eastern Europe. And they were looking everywhere. I'll follow your God, just send your troops. Everywhere except to the one who had founded them in the first place. So what does that mean? When we get to this spot, do you basically say, oh, well, it's a wash. Let's just give it up. Let's walk away. But how can I give up on you, Ephraim? How can I give up on you? How can I turn you loose, Israel? How can I leave you to be ruined like Admon, devastated like luckless Zeboim? Excuse me? Well, those were two little towns very close to Sodom and Gomorrah. Do you remember those names a little better? Sodom and Gomorrah, whose inhospitality to strangers was so revolting to God they were destroyed, and Admon, Zeboim are collateral damage in the process. Can I let you be, Israel, collateral damage? Just stand there and watch while somebody wipes you out as a minor nation, which is what you are. Can I let that happen? Boy, has this ever raised some questions for me. I can't even bear to think such thoughts. My insides churn in protest, so I'm not going to act on my anger, which means, no, I am not going to write this off. The two strongest religious ideas that were extant in this day were, number one, you scratch God's back, he scratches yours. You fail, he will rub you out. And the second one was, times are pretty good. That must mean God likes us. So we're good. And you see the possibility of any disaster and that sort of thing. I'm not going to destroy Ephraim. Why? Because they've changed? No. Because I have. Because I am God and not a human. Now, somebody who translated this fudged a little with that word human, because quite literally it says, because I am God and not male. Does that mean God's female? No. But what it does mean is this. Since every other ruler would have been a male, and since the word of that ruler had to be absolutely bound, even to the point where the ruler is bound, God is saying, I'm not going to be like that. If you remember the book of Esther in the Old Testament, There is a king who declares that all the Jews shall be rubbed out and then discovers he's married to one. Oops. But realizes that his word cannot be reversed, and therefore can only declare that the Jews are allowed to rise up against their enemies as well, and may the best person, nation, woman win. And God basically says in this verse, I'm not like that. This God will continue in relationship with those who do not continue with him. This is the God whom Jesus discovers and whom he calls Father, so that he is able to trust, even in death, that God's relationship with him continues even beyond it, even into the resurrection of the dead. I'm God and not human. I'm the Holy One, and I'm here in your very midst. The people will end up following God. I will roar like a lion. Oh, how I'll roar. The lion was the symbol of some of the enemies of Israel. God takes it up on his own. My frightened children will come running from the west like frightened birds. They'll come from Egypt, from Assyria like scared doves. I'll move them back into their homes. This is not the end. Though already he could see the people being removed from their homes and deported to another nation, his promise was, I am going to bring them back. There's so many questions that are attached to this, I don't know where to start, but it leaves me with one main question. If the God that I serve, the God who became the Father of Jesus, if this God cannot end his relationships, cannot break them, cannot simply walk away, dust his hands, and forget the people to whom he promised himself, even if it means he will keep his promises in the face of those who don't. And if I believe, what kind of person am I supposed to be? I'd like to tell you a story that illustrates this for me, though it does not answer the questions. Rather, it raises more of them for me. But the big question is still this: what kind of person follows this kind of God that will not give up and will not abandon his people? The story has to do with a music scholar, probably one of the most famous music scholars in the area of medieval music, who himself was a conductor, an instrumentalist, a soloist, worked for the BBC, and had a stunning career. His name was Clive Waring. You might have heard of him. At age 46, he met a 21-year-old woman, and the two of them fell in love. Both of them musicians. She fascinated by his passion for music, and he fascinated by hers. And 6 years after they met, they were married. Within 6 months of their wedding day, a small virus called herpes simplex 1, which in most people resides just at the base of the brainstem, and when it takes off from there every once in a while, causes cold sores. So now you know what to blame. Every, who knows how many thousand people, when that breaks loose, heads not to the lip but to the brain. In his case, it went to the brain and destroyed his episodic memory. What episodic memory means simply is that if I look at you and blink my eyes, what I see after I blink is what I saw before, and those two memories are put together, and it's part of my experience here this morning. That capacity was eradicated in his brain. It took basic elements of his long-term memory with it, so he could not remember any of his 25 years of research, for instance. He could not remember his wedding day. But he also could not remember what was happening to him at the moment. So he began to keep a journal. And page after page after page after page, which he, by the way, copied out in the hospital, simply said, I'm awake now. I'm fully awake now. I'm totally awake now. I'm here now. Because every second after he blinked his eyes and opened them up was a fresh moment. He could not remember the moment before, which means that the entire narrative of his life and therefore his personhood disappeared. She sat with him on the bed as he agonized over, who am I now and what just happened to me? And what does this mean? And asked exactly the same questions for herself. Perfectly whole, perfectly sane, now trying to discover how to love a man who couldn't remember, if he took a bite of food, what it was. And who every day needed to be reintroduced to himself when she arrived there after a 2-hour drive from her job to begin the evening's work of being with him and helping him constitute himself. They discovered 3 things. Number 1, if he talked incessantly about a few things that he did remember, that sort of constituted a sense of selfhood. The second thing was if you got him into a piece of music, because music has past, present, and future, sort of a whole life context in it, and you got him playing, he could continue with it, and he had retained that much. And the third was that in his emotional memory, he remembered he was attached to this woman who came to see him every day. And when he met her, wrapped his arms around her and announced her to be the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen in his life, and fastened his love upon her. And as the moment she left, picked up the phone and began to phone her home line, telling her on the phone that it had been so long since he'd seen her. Wouldn't she please come back? Because the moment had gone. That's it. She realized that he was being treated in a psychiatric hospital, but this was not a psychiatric disorder, and that the National Health Service in Britain, where they lived, needed to recognize brain injury and to treat it differently. And they created a kind of group home where people like this were gathered together, where it was a home, not an institution, where the food was better, where he could go out for a walk and have some semblance of a life. Even if he, in his case, couldn't remember it, he could enjoy it at the moment. And got that done. It took her 10 years. Can you imagine? They never went out. They had no friends. There was no room, no bandwidth for anything like that. He consumed everything. He went from euphoric for a few months to deeply depressed for years, to a kind of acceptance of who he was now and what he had. And then she left. He was in safe hands. His medication was reduced. He had some semblance of a life. She had done what she could. She went to New York City, and as she said, began to attend art galleries and New Age seminars. And she also said, began to date people she couldn't marry. And began to realize the reason she was doing that was that she was still in love with a man who was still in love with her as best he understood her and remembered her. And there was no possibility within herself for anything else to happen. And she thought, I'm here a continent away, and I've done everything that I could do. What else is there? And the conundrum of seeking to deal with this, she picked up a phone and called a friend she had met who was Christian, and asked that person to pray for her. The interesting thing is that her comment about that person is, I didn't think I even liked Christians. But she phoned one anyway and asked this person to pray. And by her own testimony, as that person prayed over the phone with her, there flooded into her life something like a warmth that began to be a healing presence. That presence I would name as the Spirit of Jesus Christ, whom he promised, who came even to someone who did not even understand what or who that was. The Spirit of the Christ, who follows the God who does not give up. And after some months of healing in which she came to accept the fact that her life was totally changed, there would be no babies, there would be no normal marriage, there would be nothing she had planned on, she went back to England. And after a few months of re-engaging her husband, such as he was, she put on her best dress one day, took him to a chapel, and married him again in a service he would not forget, or he would not remember as soon as they got home. And her life is now constituted in honoring the love and connection that is there in a broken man's life who loves her deeply and who is now connected to someone, connected to a God who doesn't let go. Does that mess up your mind? It sure messes up mine. And it messed up Hosea's. But what would happen in our world if a people who actually followed this God and who actually followed his Christ actually became people like him? God bless you.